Hello everyone and welcome to Through Africa. I am your host, Mercy Bamgbala. Today we dive into the world of economic relations between Africa and Europe. To understand how this relation has fared over the years, I speak with Soli Mueng, who is a brand reputation strategist. Hello, Mr. Soli.
Hello, Messi. Lovely to be here with you and to your viewers.
And thank you for accepting our invitation.
It's a
So I'd
pleasure.
like us to just go directly into the discussion. How would you describe the current balance of financial power between Africa and Europe?
Well, it's a very layered question, isn't it? Because Africa, first of all, is not one country. I mean, we tend to talk about Africa as if it was like Europe has harmonized some legislation, some policies across the European Union. But Africa is still made up of 54 different countries. Each one of them is doing their own thing, political policy differences and all that. But we also know that given the history, Africa has always served as a source of raw materials, first for the Europeans, for the Americans, for now China and Russia and Gulf states are playing a bigger role in getting what they can for, especially in terms of raw materials for future technologies in Africa. So Africa needs to stand up. And again, I'm very careful when I say Africa because, as I said, it's not one country. But globally, Africa needs to harmonize certain policies at home. Africa needs to be clear about what it wants. It cannot continuously be begging because it has what much of the world needs, but it has to be clear about the terms of engagement with different parts of the world. And it mustn't put too much emotion in trade relations, in foreign relations. It's not about who loves you or whom you love or who hates you, who likes you less. It's about what can we get from this. In other words, Africa needs to learn to be a lot more transactional.
Exactly. I mean, that's a narrative we're also trying to work on. You know, Africa is not a country, it is a continent, a huge one at that. So, are current European investments in Africa really helping to, build long-term capacity, or do they primarily benefit the European investors?
Well, it's normal that they should. Remember that investors are not charity givers. I mean, investors invest because they want to gain value on their investment. There's got to be some kind of return on investment. So Africans must stop thinking that Europe is there to just give them food for nothing. Where these funds come from, there are investors who want to see returns. So Africa should be saying to itself, how do we make it a win-win situation? In other words, how do we make sure that these guys see the value of their investments in Africa and they put more FDI in Africa, but they also get something out of it, but not at our global expense. In other words, how do we also extract value for ourselves? Europe is there not as a charity NGO, it's there to invest and to extract value. We must be very clear about that. But how does Africa play its part? How does Africa sell itself? How does Africa harmonize the kind of policies, but also the preparedness in terms of infrastructure at local level that ensures that it becomes attractive and investors are able to see long term. Europe, it tends to be long term in its investments in Africa compared to China, which comes to build big things, and there's a huge problem of collateralization, where we've seen African countries failing to refund or to pay back their loans to China, and China can be quite brutal in that.
Now let's talk about debt. You mentioned China, and I know that practically a huge sum of African countries are owing China. What role does European debt play in African development? Is it support or dependency?
Well, European investments, as I said, they're there their investment. Investors put money in order to get something in return out of it. But I think they tend to be longer term compared to Chinese investments. They tend to look. I mean, now obviously the whole just energy transition from decarbonization to moving to cleaner sources of energy like wind to solar PVs and that sort of thing. that's a big thing. But in investing in batteries and storage facilities for renewable energy, I think Europeans tend to be putting a lot more money into that. But by default, it's a long-term transition. Is a long-term journey. In other words, they have to create local capacity. They have to find local partners. They have to leave something in return, including skilling of locals in terms of this. It's not coming in building bridges, long bridges and railways with foreign workers like China usually does, and then they take them out when the project is done and the country is indebted. So I think Europe remains the biggest FDI contributor to Africa, and it's long term. I think Africa should appreciate it. Africa should take emotions out of this. Oh, they colonized us, they're not our friends. We must forget that stuff. You know, the past is the past is the past. We need to say, well, now how do we structure the relationships with different partners? And I think that the advantage to Africa today, at least it should be, is that there's a diversification of suitors, if you want. You know, China, the USA, the Gulf states, the Europeans, of course, which are the biggest. All of these are there. So Slavic or Africa should learn to play these against one another in terms of deal making. They shouldn't be emotional about it. I think also African policies shouldn't be based on the head of state. A lot of times it's head of states making deals with foreigners at the expense of their own countries. So there's a lot of lesson that Africa needs to go through in order to strengthen its position vis-a-vis its various partners.
Definitely, you're right there. Considering the just concluded EU-AU summit that was in November, I believe, how can Africa, you've mentioned some of, the things that we're supposed to be doing better, but how can we really negotiate more favorable terms in future loan agreements with these European institutions?
Mm-hmm. Look, building local capacity is important so that people don't just come in and zoom out. But I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the harmonization of policies at continental level. I think the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Initiative is a good one. The Agenda 2063 is a good agenda. But I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done about how do we as a continent or as sub-regions, ECOWAS or SADC, Southern African Development Community, and others say, what are the policies that must cut across, so that when we speak with say Europe, which is harmonized in a lot of ways, when we speak to Europe, how do we speak in one language? How do we ensure that the benefits spread across, but we have the same policy facilitation? In other words, we don't have one policy that over there that pushes or contradicts another over there. So Africa could be stronger united, just like Europe is stronger united.
Yes.
But it can be on the basis of policies that don't exist. They have to be very, very clear about what they really want.
So yeah, just moving forward from this topic, the final question I'd like to really ask is, what does a fair and mutually beneficial financial relationship between these two parties, what do you think it would look like?
Well, it would leave benefits behind. It shouldn't be one that just that extracts the value from Africa and that takes it away elsewhere. I think that it should be long-term. It should create, say, business development, support business. Basically, the value chain should not just be based in Europe. One can understand that European countries come to Africa to support European firms, because the relationships now are not only with states in Europe, they're also states with companies. So they are based with companies in Europe, but which are supported by the European Union. So Africa should also stand behind private enterprise in Africa, strengthen local capacity, ensure that people, and including with skills, negotiation skills, so that when people sit in those rooms with their European counterparts, they're very clear about what they're looking for. They're very clear about what they can give, what they cannot give. As I mentioned briefly, the whole issue of collateralization, which can be quite toxic, or concessionality, what do we give, what are we prepared to give, to what extent, in return for loans, in return for FDI, what do you want in return, how do we measure what we want? So Africa can't just sit there and beg and expect the world to be kind to it. Africa must be very clear about what it wants and how it's going to get it in a fair world, because the truth is much of the money comes from out of Africa, but Africa cannot just sit there and say, okay, because we are beggars, we'll just take anything that gets given to us at any cost.
You make very solid points there. Thank you very much, Solim Weng, for joining us on the show today. We do appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Mercy. Thank you very much.
And now we move to West Africa, where Guinea-Bissau is once again facing serious political instability after the country's 2025 elections. Voters went to the polls on November 23rd to choose a new president and parliament. But before the results could even be announced, the situation took a dramatic turn. Just 3 days later, gunfire broke out near key government buildings in the capital, Bissau. Soon after, a group of military officers appeared on national television saying they are taking control of the country to, quote, restore security. They shut down the borders, stopped the vote counting process, and declared the start of a military-led transition. The military then appointed General Horta Inta as the transitional president and named Elijovi Arete as prime minister, giving the junta full control over the government. A major shock came when the National Electoral Commission revealed that armed men had stolen ballot papers, destroyed vote counting documents, and damaged the servers holding the election data. This means the entire election has been disrupted and no winner can be declared. Many people inside and outside the country believe the military stepped in to stop an election outcome that may not have served its interests. Others point to Guinea-Bissau's long history of coups and political tension as a sign that deeper issues are at play. The international community has reacted strongly. The African Union and the ECOWAS have both suspended Guinea-Bissau, calling the coup a clear break from constitutional order. The United Nations has also condemned the takeover and demanded the release of detained officials. Inside the country, the new authorities have banned protests and public gatherings, and there are growing concerns about arrests, intimidation of journalists, and limits on basic freedoms. Right now, Guinea-Bissau is in a state of uncertainty. The election results no longer exist, and there is no clear plan for when new elections will take place. The military has offered only vague promises for a one-year transition, and citizens feel the future is unclear. And with that, we have come to the end of today's episode on Through Africa. I am your host, Mercy Bamgola. If you would like to send us questions or suggestions on the show as you have watched today, you can kindly do so on our WhatsApp number, which is always on the screen. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe and goodbye.